Signore e signori, buonasera. Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò, for the presentation of this book, Just Passing Through, the Diaries and Photographs of Milton Gendel. And to me personally, this is a great joy to celebrate the publication of this book in the US, because in 2014, we had the fortune of having an exhibit of photographs by Milton Gendel just upstairs. We did it in collaboration with the American Academy in Rome. And I'm the luckiest of the luckiest because for about 2 months, I came to work every day and had the company of Milton Gendel and of his friends on the walls of the Casa leading to my office. And including one of the photographs was, I believe, one that was also published this morning in the New York Times, beautiful New York Times review that came out, of Andre Leon Talley with Lord Snowdon, Princess Margaret's husband, wearing very big Fendi fur coats. And in those days when the exhibit was up on the walls, Mr. Talley was our guest. So he came for the lecture, and then after I wanted to surprise him, and pretending of nothing, I showed him the exhibit, and then, that's me! So that's the kind of thing that happened when Milton Gendel is around and evoked. As you probably have seen from the review of the New York Times, the only little defect that they find in this book is that they would have wanted more. And we know that there are millions of words, and there are thousands and thousands of pages. So the work that Cullen Murphy did in editing and deciding what to distill from this wealth of beautiful photographs and pages is really a heroic work. And tonight, to talk about the book, along with the editor, Cullen Murphy, we have the fortune of having the daughter of Milton Gendel, Anna Gendel Mathias. And I went back to my email, and as the gentleman that he was, Mr. Gendel sent me a very nice email to thank me for the exhibit that we were having here. And along other things, he couldn't come. We expected him to be present. He couldn't come. And then that's what he says. My daughter, Anna Mathias, her husband and family, will be there. She's an art historian who was at the Metropolitan Museum, New York for a time, and wrote a cultural guide to New York. Perhaps she might replace me at the round table you have planned. So I think I take this as a prophetic note, and I think it applies also to tonight. So I would like to invite you to please welcome Cullen Murphy and Anna Gendel, please.
Thank you very much, Stefano, and thank you to Casa Italiana for having us here, and thanks to all of you for coming and joining us this evening. Anna, thank you for collaborating over the course of 3 or 4 years. You really are the co-editor of this book. And also here this evening is Milton's wife, Monica Incisa. Though I can't see where you are, there you are. I'd like to thank you for your help and your support and your wisdom from the outset. It has really meant the world to have the collaboration of both of you. So this evening, Anna and I.
Could you get closer?
Oh, sure. So this evening, Anna and I have chosen about 20 photographs to guide our remarks and conversation. And when we're done with those, then we'll have time for questions from any of you. And I think we should probably just dive right in. So let's start with Milton Gendel when he arrives in Rome. This is one of my favorite photographs. It's taken by a photographer and adventurer named Josephine Powell. It's in 1950, and it's in the studio of Alberto Buria, an artist who was a friend of Milton's, and about whom he wrote for Art News. This is a Milton Gendel I never knew. I wasn't even born when this picture was taken. But I love the look. I love the stance. And I just thought I would start by reading a short passage about Milton, because part of the task of putting this book together was, in my own mind, trying to place Milton and his place in his own life and in the society that he inhabited. So I'll start right here. Placing Milton Gendel, defining his life, his work, his context, his role, is not a conventional task. He was a photographer, a critic, a sounding board, a facilitator, a convener, a collector. Asked why he had chosen to spend his life in Rome, he would generally reply that he was just passing through, which is what everybody is doing in Rome, whether they know it or not. His various homes in the city were certainly a destination for others passing through. Writers and artists, actors and journalists, aristocrats and arrivistes, and members of what used to be called the jet set. It was a long 20th century moment that will someday have a name. Privately, Gendel was a diarist, leaving behind daily entries totaling some 10 million words. The diaries cover everything from mundane details of Gendel's family life to accounts of his travels and observations about books, movies, and the arts. Gendel was a superb writer with an ear for the sharp as well as the absurd, a sly sense of humor, and a gift for a decisive assessment. The sex scenes in Zabriskie Point, he writes in one entry, bring to mind, quote, coupling dogs trying to obey the laws of the Stanislavski method, unquote. So, we'll move on to the next, and Anna.
Thank you, Cullen, very much indeed. So this is a photograph taken in an apartment which originally was not for my father. It was an apartment which my father found for my mother. It was a very glamorous place on the Tiber Island, and it had been recently done up by Miti Risi, an Australian painter. And it was very typical that my father should find a really wonderful apartment and make sure that my mother occupied it. And in time when they married, it became his home as well. And I think the photograph indicates a little bit of a sort of collaboration between them. My mother had all her furniture shipped out from a house in Norfolk, a kind of country house in Norfolk. And so, you know, you can see these reproduction Queen Anne chairs, Chinese lamps, chintz-covered armchairs, but behind the sofa is a wonderful abstract expressionist canvas by Toti Shaloya. So I think that, you know, their kind of collaboration was just starting there. Just another note, they were both crazy about animals. And you see that absolutely at the center of a composition is Polly the parrot. I was told growing up that my mother cried for 3 days straight after Polly died.
So besides the place on Tiber Island, Milton lived in a number of other faded palazzi around Rome, and one of them overlooked Piazza Mattei, which is where this photograph is taken. I love this photograph for a number of reasons. One is because the tortoise fountain is my favorite fountain in Rome, and it was Milton's favorite fountain, I think because he looked at it every day for so long. But I also like the energy in this photograph, and I like the juxtaposition of the animate and the inanimate, which is a feature of so many of his photographs. And, you know, animate and inanimate is often another way of saying past and present. And when I've gone back and looked at photographs by Milton, you just can't escape that juxtaposition of these two things. And in particular, I like the fact that the inanimate form here seems to have so much more life than the people who are technically alive.
Very, very true. Well, on that theme, my parents went to the south of France to visit Douglas Cooper, the great collector of Picasso, and stopped off in Arles. And so, of course, my mother, dressed very respectably in her cotton frock, handbag, and string of pearls, took on the persona of Van Gogh. And there's a whole series of photographs of her dressed up as Van Gogh, and I think it rather illustrates the shared sense of humor that they have. They both love dressing up, and both the visual and the real joke here.
So the next photograph that we chose is chosen because it's almost a visual pun on this one, and that is this one. It's Lady Diana Cooper, who was a close friend of Milton's. When you think about the place of Milton Gendel, I can't help but think about him as if he's kind of a planet who is either being circled by other planets or himself is circling other planets or suns, whatever the truth is about Copernicus. And Lady Diana Cooper was one of these planets, and she was a social and artistic and literary node unto herself. But I love the way in which she herself embodies kind of a statuesque reality, as well as a very human form. Look at that cigarette held down in her right hand, as if she's saying, I'll do what I want, but I'll preserve the forms of etiquette. Anna, I believe Diana Cooper was the person who introduced your parents?
Indeed, yes, absolutely. Yes, so after Diana was widowed, she increasingly spent a lot of time in Rome. She had a great friend called Jenny Cross, who was the daughter of Robert Graves. She was a journalist in her own right, and she was married to Patrick Cross, the head of Reuters in Rome. And so Diana used to go and visit her, and there, in a wonderful apartment overlooking the Trajan's Forum on the Palazzo del Grillo, she met my father and decided that she would try and arrange for my father to meet my mother, invited my father to stay at Chantilly, where she had a grace and favor house, and he never turned up. So she didn't give up. She then took my mother to Rome, and they met probably in late 1956.
One of the things you may notice if you happen to read this book is how many stories there are of how difficult it is to arrange a marriage for another person. And the classic one is the story of Mimi Pecci Blunt's 18 suitors. Anna, here is Bill Paley and Fulco.
Yes. So when we were preparing this talk, I wanted to choose some photographs which had a New York resonance. And here is Bill Paley with Fulco Verdura in Venice. And Fulco Verdura was a Sicilian duke, most wonderful jewelry designer, and now with a New York hub in that the rights to his jewelry designs were bought by Ward and Judith Landrigan, who are sort of great experts in the arts from Sotheby's, and they run the Verdura Gallery off Fifth Avenue. Fulco was a great wit. He too loved dressing up, and there are wonderful photographs, not by Milton, of all the dressing up that took place at Mimi Pecci Blunt's house, with him dressed as Philip the Mad, and my mother as Joanna the Mad, and my mother as Philip II. There's a wonderful kind of vignette of them dressed up as an Etruscan tomb, and they're both sort of sitting there. It's just brilliant. And Bill Paley, talking with Cullen before the talk, just the fact that it was the jet set. You know, these were extremely rich and fortunate people who had the means to travel wherever they wanted and buy whatever they wanted. But I think it's important to note that they were really interesting people with wonderful senses of humor and great sort of vision and generosity. You know, Bill Paley had a very ordinary background. I think he was working class or middle class Jewish boy from New York who then ended up running CBS. And just on a personal note, he was a remarkably kind person to me after my mother died. And when I would turn up in New York, he would summon me to the offices of CBS, where he would dispense checks for $200, $300, $400, and off I would go, and it was wonderful.
So speaking of people who can afford a jet set lifestyle, this is Peggy Guggenheim. And in the diaries, both the 10 million words as well as the 65,000 words, one person who threads through from beginning to end is Peggy Guggenheim. Milton had known Peggy from his very earliest days, fresh out of Columbia, and when he was living just a few blocks from here on Washington Square. And you know, Milton, as you know, was very caught up, deeply involved in the Surrealist movement and with Andre Breton. And Peggy Guggenheim at that time in the late 30s was literally airlifting artists from Europe to safety in the United States as war was about to engulf the continent. What I find remarkable about this picture is just the hominess of what is a palazzo in Venice. You know, of course it is now a museum, but to see it as a home with objects on the walls and in the rooms, as if this was a place where primarily that you were living, which is what it was. There's something that's very warm about that. And I like the way that you can't even see what all the artworks are in this picture. It took me about 3 or 4 times looking at this photograph before I realized there's a Calder mobile on the right that is sort of hidden by the other objects. Anna?
So here is Diana Cooper again. This was a picnic held at the house of Babs Johnson, and Babs Johnson is the woman in the lower right of the photograph. She was really called Marion Johnson, and she'd been brought up in India. Her father had been a British Army officer in India, and she was wonderful. She also had a nom de plume. She was Georgina Masson, and wrote the Companion Guide to Rome and wrote a history of gardens in Italy. She was really wonderful. I mean, on the surface, she looked like a sort of proper jolly hockey sticks English woman, but of course she had great depths and subtleties. And she lived in a sort of garden house grotto which belonged to Prince Doria Pamphili, and it was a wonderful place to have picnics. So there is the picnic, and Evelyn Waugh is a guest, as you can see. I was telling Cullen that my father didn't like Evelyn Waugh. You'll see this in the book. But one of the reasons he didn't like him was that my father was Jewish, but he had really no faith at all. He would describe himself sometimes as an agnostic, sometimes as an atheist. And he was shocked one day to find me in my Moses basket, several months old, and Waugh, who was staying with us. And my father said that Evelyn Waugh had my baby hand and was tracing the sign of a cross. And my father was not impressed by this. The fact that I eventually did convert to Catholicism is a little bit strange.
There are some memorable moments of Milton taking on Evelyn Waugh with sarcasm, and I mean, it probably was not easy to put Evelyn Waugh in his place, but he certainly provided enough material. So this next photograph, it's one of my favorite series of photographs, at least of the ones that I've seen. There probably are 7 or 8, all of this character. It's Iris Origo, and the photographs are taken in Palazzo Orsini. I don't know why the photographs have this effect. I don't know whether, do you happen to know? I don't know whether it was a deliberate effect or something that occurred by accident, but he clearly liked it because Milton was extremely deliberate in the photographs that he saved. And you know, there are 72,000 negatives in Fondazione Primoli, but the books that he bound every year don't hold anything like that number. They hold perhaps 2,000 or 1,000, and yet he chose 7 or 8 of this particular series of photographs, and it is undeniably haunting. You know, it is moody and ghostly, and I think it was especially resonant because the reputation of Iris Origo has been enjoying such a resurgence in recent years. I think mainly because of the republication of many of her books by New York Review of Books Press, which has been a terrific endeavor. And Iris Origo's voice, I think, when she writes about the coming of the war, when she writes about you know, a merchant in you know, early Renaissance Tuscany, you know, still speaks to us very very clearly, and yet her life, you know, as privileged as it might have been, was not always easy. And there's one passage that I would like to read. Milton is at a party, and he has taken her aside, and he's speaking with her by herself. First, she speaks about you and how nice it was to have you staying over. She spoke about her shyness, how she always felt out of things when she was a girl, especially as she had to change among 3 different cultures, American, Italian, and English. Bernard Berenson dismayed her once when she was 17, and he hurled a challenging question at her across the room, which was full of people. She mustered her courage and answered, something about what she wanted out of life. "That's what I mean," he said with disdain, addressing the others. "That is conventional thinking." She spoke about his diaries and his self-dissatisfaction. I said that it was a pity he had been born too soon. He was a generation or 2 out of line. Nowadays, there would be very little conflict over his commercial operations and his scholarship. He didn't have enough balance to see that he had gotten out of life the most that he was capable of. He was a worldling with dreams of monastic, cloistered scholarship. And here's someone we recognize.
Yes, so we're back staying with Peggy Guggenheim again. I was looking over the diary for this time, and she wasn't there. So I guess that's why I decided to cut loose and start fingering the call. Wonderful.
So Anna will be speaking about Princess Margaret in just a moment in a different way, but this photograph you know, shows Princess Margaret on the left and a curator from the Vatican Museums on the right, and obviously it's the Sistine Chapel that's in the background. What has always struck me about this photograph is the way in which Milton so often deals with the idea of monumentality. Many of the things that he photographed were, in some sense, monumental. And certainly many of the things that he wrote about, the Colosseum or the pyramids, were also monumental. But unlike, for instance, Ansel Adams, where the subject matter is obviously monumental and you're meant to understand the monumentality, it never comes across that way in Milton's photographs. The monumentality seems to somehow have been made intimate. And this particular photograph, I thought, illustrated that. I mean, you know that there's a soccer field of paint that is represented by that figure. But in fact, your attention is drawn also to the silhouetted figures. And it's obvious that what's really the center of the photograph is a conversation that you can't see, but you know what the subject of the conversation is. It's such an artful photograph of it, and it's the intimacy combined with the monumentality that isn't, that really comes across here. Now here's the next.
Yes, absolutely. Could we just go back to the previous one
Yes.
very quickly? I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak a little bit about
Please use the microphone.
Certainly, I'm sorry, ma'am. To have the opportunity to speak a little bit about Princess Margaret, who was a great friend of my mother's. They met in the mid-50s, and then she became friends with my father, and certainly after my mother's death in 1972, she was probably his closest friend in England of my mother's friends. She was my godmother, and I think Cullen's analysis of the photograph is wonderful and very astute. I also love it because it shows a side that's rarely represented for a woman who was highly intelligent and took great pride in the knowledge of Italian art and history that she had developed over years and years and years of visiting Italy, often with my father. She wrote notes. Her knowledge was deep and extensive. And so, when you see a depiction of somebody in The Crown, for example, who is a sort of raddled old soak, it bears nothing, no similarity to the woman I knew, who was also a really wonderful godmother. She was stalwart and loyal and kind and generous, and also fantastically familiar. She would say things like, "Darling, you should wear some lipstick." So there was a lot of practical advice. She was very enthusiastic about when Charlie and I got engaged. She said, "I think it's a very good idea. Apart from anything else, it's better to have been married than never to be married." But looking at this photograph, apart from the fact that I think it's a stunning portrait of a very, very beautiful woman in a great moment of vivacity, this is a very familiar pose to me and to Monica. We would walk into the drawing room at Kensington Palace, and the first thing was that you were always offered a drink, and the life of this woman who was extremely vivacious and bright and very, very funny would immediately envelop you.
That is quite an assortment of bottles back there.
Choice.
So here's another royal with a hand outstretched. This is the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And it's part of another series of photographs that Milton took. And again, a series that he liked sufficiently to have laid them out in a row in his scrapbooks. The story is this. You probably know the statue. It's an equestrian statue. It's up on top of the Capitol. It's a very old statue. It dates back to Roman times, and it was in sore need of repair. and in the 1980s, it was taken from its traditional place on the piazza designed by Michelangelo, and it was brought for restoration. So in order for that to happen, the workmen had to make him dismount from his horse, take the horse and rider to a place where they were going to be restored. In order for this to happen, Marcus Aurelius had to be, he had his head wrapped in plastic, his hands wrapped in plastic. He was put in the back of a pickup truck, and then the pickup truck went through the streets of Rome as crowds lined the streets, and he had his arm out. And Milton chronicled the journey to the place of restoration, and then the journey back from the place of restoration. And it feels like, a Roman imperial triumph going down the Via Sacra, except that it's with, pickup trucks and jeeps.
Again, on a personal, familial note, Sebastiano and Natalia are my half-brother and sister, twins, born in 1958 from my father's relationship with Vittorio Olivetti. And I really love this photograph, although it's quite a sad photograph in many ways, because it wasn't an easy, Milton and Vittoria's relationship wasn't easy, and thus the relationship with the children wasn't easy. It was sort of like that of a divorced father and his children, but 10 times more in a way. But the photograph is so affectionate, and it shows the great pride that my father felt in Natalia and Sebastiano. He was really kind of bowled over by how bright and charming and good-looking they were. And I think this photograph is a little bit of a poster to that relationship.
So keeping the focus partly on Sebastiano, the person on the left, as many of you will know, is Anthony Armstrong Jones, Lord Snowdon, Princess Margaret's husband, and Sebastiano is on the right. Now, Tony Snowdon, as I would never call him, is a frequent character in the diaries, and I think it's safe to say that mostly he does not come across as an altruist or a person thinking about anything other than himself and his own needs. So it kind of stops you in your tracks to see this photograph where he is, from what I can tell, trying to help Sebastiano read English. I wish I knew what the book was. And I hope it's not Finnegan's Wake. But the other thing about this photograph is that there's a third character here, and that is the bed. This bed, if there's, it may be the most, the most important model in all of Milton's photographs, because it appears, as far as I can tell, beginning in the early 1960s, and then henceforward. And I don't know, was it still in the apartments in 2018?
Yes, now it's in Essex.
The fact that this bed keeps reappearing is something that I've always enjoyed when going through the bound books of Milton's photographs. What can you tell us about it?
Well, the bed is Neapolitan, and at one point, I don't know quite how it came about, but Michelangelo Antonioni chose my parents' apartment as the set for L'Avventura, for really the first quarter of L'Avventura. And there's a wonderfully kind of tense, sexually charged scene between, I think, Monica Vitti or Lea Massari, with Monica Vitti in bed. And so the bed is a movie star, really. You're absolutely right. Again, choosing photographs which have a New York relevance, and I know that we have friends in the audience here who will recognize one of Milton's greatest friends, Tom Hess, who was editor of Art News, and in my memory, a really wonderful adult to my childhood. Tom was kind and generous. He was also, I think, the funniest person I ever met in my life. Actually, I can tell this joke because you're practically all Italophones, but there was a rather grand woman. She'd married an Antinori, and she decided to call her children Albiera, Alessia, and do you remember the third one? Allegra. And I said, oh, if you have a fourth daughter, what will you call her? And Tom, quick as a whip, said, Abbastanza. Enough.
So here is J. Paul Getty, who at the time was, whether he was or not, I don't know, but he was always referred to as the richest man in the world. And he had an estate on the coast, not far from Rome, and Milton went to interview him on several occasions. And there was always something very stilted and odd about the encounters. I mean, when you look at him, do you think there might be something stilted and odd about your encounter with him? You know, there was one time in the house. There were these very, very narrow slits. You could, scarcely put your hand through them. And Getty looks through one of the slits and starts worrying about an intruder coming in through them. When Milton asked, Getty how he would like to be photographed, he suggested he'd like to be photographed with this porphyry basin. In many ways, he seemed to define himself by his objects, but also by his by the kind of bargain he could strike. And so there's a moment when Milton asks him what his favorite work of art is that he owns. And he says, well, it would have to be, and then he gives the name of a painting by Raphael and says, it was misattributed and I bought it for 40 pounds.
Yes. So here is a portrait of my stepmother, Monica, and I love it mainly because it's of her. I have to say, but formally, it's also a ravishing photograph as far as I'm concerned. Going back to what Cullen has said about my father's eye for form and monumentality, the fountain really is exemplary there. I love the fact that Monica looks tolerant of being photographed yet again. And I have to say that my father was not a man who ever saw himself as a family man. He didn't think he would ever marry. He never thought he would have any children. So the fact that he ended up more or less with 4 wives and 3 children was a sort of accident of fate, a kind of just passing through, I guess. But of his 4 marriages, his marriage to Monica was far and beyond his happiest marriage, his most successful marriage, and he really, really worshipped Monica, and she was wonderful to him until the day that he died.
So another recurring character in the photographs and in the diaries is the flea market at Porta Portese. And Milton would go every weekend, just about, judging from the diaries. In fact, there are times when diaries are undated, but we know that it has to be a particular date because he was going to the flea market. And so I don't know, how many thousands of times he went, often in company with someone like Josephine Powell or by himself. And it wasn't as if he needed anything, and he didn't know what he was looking for, but he generally came back with something, as I'm sure Anna and Chuck attest from having to go through the contents of the apartments, and it's with great fastidiousness that he documents every transaction that occurs at the flea market, down to the process of haggling. It started at this many 100,000 lira, and we got him to this, and then I had to go back up to that in order for this to happen. And it's a remarkable thread that goes through the diaries. And he does find some remarkable things, including at one point something that is advertised as Mussolini's bathtub.
In 1976, Princess Margaret invited my father and me to stay at Balmoral. And at the end of the 10 days that we were there, my father, as he had every day, said to the Queen, "Ma'am, may I take some photographs?" At which point the Queen said, "Yes, by all means. I'm surprised you have any film left." And indeed, there are many, many photographs taken during that stay. And this is the photograph which has struck most people's imagination the most. And of course, it shows the Queen at her most practical. She did feed the corgis every day. It wasn't sort of delegated to a member of her staff. I was telling Cullen that I was 14, and one of the corgis had a tick on it. So I rather bossily said to the Queen, "Oh, ma'am, sailor or skipper or whatever has got a tick on him." And the Queen said, "Well, take it off." Which I did.
And this is the last photograph that we'll show this evening. I see that we're 45 minutes in. And it's not a photograph by Milton, it's by Igor Palman. But I'd like to pause on it for a particular reason that I've already spoken to Anna about. So the photograph is from 1975. Milton is at midlife. And when I first saw this photograph, the thing that struck me was that, I knew Milton in the last years of his life. I never once saw him take a photograph because he was older and his hands were not always steady. And so this captures for me something about Milton that I never actually saw. He must have looked like this quite a lot. And so I'm grateful to have it. And I remember asking Monica about how Milton went about taking photographs, because when you see some of the photographs that he's taken, some of the situations he's in, you have to wonder, well, how did he do it without people noticing? And so I spoke with Monica about that, and I'd like to let her have the last word here. So this is Monica describing those moments, and also his attitude towards the photographs that he took. He managed to be unobtrusive. First of all, he was always a participant in the group. He wasn't like, you know, a photographer that you hire and sits apart. He somehow managed to speak and then maybe take a picture and then put the camera down. And he was never noticeable. You knew he was taking pictures, but you didn't think about it. Secondly, he was doing a lot of editing after the fact, so he never would publish or use photographs where the pictures of people or the composition itself were not successful. And he always used the best possible picture of a person. His pictures are never aggressive. He was respectful of the things he took pictures of. His pictures have a certain sweetness. He took pictures like the way he spoke. Thank you very much. And it may be that people in the audience have questions to ask or comments to make or observations, since I know many people here knew Milton. And there's a young woman here with a microphone.
And maybe while we wait for the first question, we want to remind the audience that there are the books for sale upstairs. There's a bookseller, and you can purchase your copy of the book we just presented.
Thank you. Would you like?
Yes, thank you very much.
We just need one person to be first. Yes.
Cullen, how did you first meet Milton?
Colin, if you could repeat the question for
Yes.
the recording.
Yes, the question is, how did I first meet Milton? And it came about through my boss at the time, Graydon Carter at Vanity Fair, who had had some dealings with Milton, and I'm not entirely clear what they were, but I was working on some other books. I was in Rome fairly frequently, and Graydon said, you know, have you met Milton Gendel? And I said no. Graydon kept two of Milton's books of photographs on a round table in his office. And he said, well, you really should. So that was the initial impetus that put us in touch. And then another friend, you know, made the specific introduction, and then I showed up, you know, one afternoon at the at Palazzo Primoli, and there he was with the wooden door, the big wooden door open, and he was leaning against the other door, and he was wearing a sweater, and you know, he looked very lank and fit and comfortable. So that was how it began.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for having shared with us the New York-themed photographs of Milton. And what strikes me in his story is that when you try to define him, as Colin mentioned in the beginning, it's very hard to do it with a word. You cannot. And photographer is definitely one of the things he did with more passion and competence and originality. But the thing that strikes me the most is that whenever you talk about a contemporary Italian artist or a American novelist that goes to Italy, he's always there. So he was this incredible crossroad of cultural diplomacy between Italy and the US. He was himself the crossroad of all these connections. And all the people you mentioned, from Myers Origo to Totti Scialoia, they all somehow had a contact with him that was also the bridge to go to the other part of the Atlantic. And I think that's probably the most remarkable thing for which he should remember. From my point of view, doing the job that I do, running a place like this, he was, like many Casa Italiana and Casa Americane, at the same time, creating this relationship between intellectuals and artists on the two sides of the ocean. I think that's a remarkable thing that he did, and I want to just share these thoughts with you. Thank you.
Do you want something to say about that? I do too.
Okay. Thank you, Stefano. I agree. I think that was an important part of his achievement in the long run. Not that he necessarily set out to do that. Although I would imagine that his work with Adriano Olivetti was pretty seminal there. Olivetti was a poster boy for the Marshall Plan. Really, he was a benevolent industrialist. He was Jewish. He was on the left, but not too scarily. He was, he had this wonderful impulse to protect the Italian built environment and patrimony, and together with Tom Hess, he was probably one of the most significant male relationships that Milton had. So I think that's probably important to note.
And one further thing which reinforces your point and is also indicates some work to be done. The kind of role that you're talking about that Milton played, and that is very hard to define specifically, and yet is very large and diffuse and essential. That role is locked into these diaries. What is published here is, as I mentioned earlier, just 65,000 words out of 10 million. So can you imagine what is inside those other, I'm not going to do the math, those other 9 point something million words. There's a record here of artistic and literary and social activity spanning the Atlantic, concentrated in Rome, significantly in London, and somewhat in New York, that is just brimming with factual information, stories, insight. And I've mentioned this to Anna before. At some point, the full range of the diaries, more than I could have done in a brief archaeological dig, really need the attention of a real scholar of this period, and I hope that the diaries will one day get what they truly deserve.
Are the diaries part of the foundation?
Sorry,
Are Milton's diaries part of the foundation, or they belong to the family?
They belong to us, the family, yes, absolutely. And as well as a sort of quite an extensive correspondence. I mean, for example, the correspondence between Milton and Tom Hess, is not only fascinating, but extremely funny.
Hi, thank you. It's almost as though the photograph represents 3 dimensions and life coming through it. My question has to do with the Marshall Plan. Could have it been also because during the early 1950s, late 40s, early 50s, Italy was struggling between 2 emerging superpowers, meaning Russia and the United States?
I didn't understand what the what was. I'm sorry. Yes, and what about them? Oh, yes, I see what you mean. I'm sure that is exactly the reason. It was a very significant chess piece that was in play and regarded as such by both superpowers. Anyone else here?
Can I just add a
Yes.
note on that? That just reminds me of the fact that it was always interesting hearing Milton talk about his application for a Fulbright scholarship. He was amongst the first year to be granted the Fulbright scholarship in 1949. And originally he had wanted to go back to China, where he had served with the US Corps of Engineers. But of course, the onset of a Cultural Revolution made that impossible. So the Fulbright Commission offered him Hong Kong or Italy. And he said he didn't want to go to Hong Kong because Hong Kong was a sort of tin pot island, a colonial outpost. It was too provincial and small. He didn't want to go there. It wasn't China, and quite rightly. And having been, very much on the left growing up in New York, he said he certainly didn't want to go to Italy, which was a fascist country, but he decided that he could perhaps have a go, and the rest is history.
So I just wanted to say one thing in closing. I see that it's now 7:30, and it has been an enormous privilege to be allowed inside the family, as it were. I was a stranger to Milton. I arrived on his doorstep literally out of the blue, and he welcomed me and saw me whenever I was in Rome. And in time, I got to know Anna, and I got to know Monica, and I got to know other members of the family. I didn't dream, I had no thought of doing anything like this until really a few years before Milton died, and he began to speak about his diaries. He sometimes would leave pages out for me to look at. To be allowed ultimately to have essentially free reign of this material, both the diaries and the photographs, represents an enormous amount of trust, for which I am grateful to you and Monica and the family. Thank you very much.
And I don't think that Monica and I could think that anybody else could have done it, because Cullen's integrity is such that we trust him implicitly, and it was quite a hot potato. It is quite a hot potato.
Thank you very much. Watch your step.